About Arunima and I were just talking about how we would do this, and we also want to raise broader questions. So I was looking at the title Women in the Workplace, Subverting Stereotypes, Negotiating Security, and I thought, let me talk a little bit about each of the terms in this title that we need to unpack. First, of course, is workplace, women and workplace. And it's interesting that when we say workplace, we are thinking of some kind of place where apparently women work, but you don't think of the home as the workplace, right? When you say workplace, the assumption is workplace versus home, where there's no work that happens. So we need to, first of all, I think we need to unpack the idea of work as feminists have done for decades. Nothing I'm going to say is wildly original. I'm going to bring, thank you. So we need to begin. So I was saying that nothing I'm going to say is wildly original. I'm drawing on feminist scholarship and practice of decades. So let's think first about how work is defined. And what feminists have pointed out is that there is an assumed difference between the domain of production and the domain of reproduction. And production is seen as the space where, so production is the space where wages are paid for the work that you do. And reproduction is not considered work. It's feminists who have started, who insisted that reproduction is a sphere of work as well. By reproduction, we mean not just biological reproduction. We do mean biological reproduction. That is the actual production of new human beings. But by reproduction, we also mean the reproduction of labor power. So reproduction of labor, and that is laboring bodies, but also reproduction of labor power. Now, what do we mean by the reproduction of labor power? That people who have to go back to work the next day. They have to work today and then they have to go back to work the next day. And for their labor power to be reproduced, certain things have to be done at home. Food has to be cooked, children have to be looked after, water has to be brought from miles away. If you're, for most women in India, that is part of their routine work. They walk for miles to get water, they walk for miles to get firewood. So all of this work, which is done to maintain and reproduce labor power, is unpaid labor, zero wages. It's not considered as work, but it is this unwaged labor that lies at the basis of the sphere of production. Production could not take place if all this unpaid work was not carried out. Now, what happens is that once you take into account this sphere of reproduction as work, then several questions emerge. So there was a debate in the 70s among feminists in the West, but that debate was also carried out to some extent in India in the 80s. And that debate was about wages for housework. Should housework be paid wages? Right? Should women who do housework be paid wages? And the debate was in this way, that supposing we agree that women should be paid wages for housework, who pays the wages? Does the employer pay the wages? Because really the entire system is based on this unpaid wage labor. If this labor had to be paid for, the system would collapse, right? So if you insist on wages for labor, who pays? Does the employer pay? And if the employer pays, does the employer pay the woman who's doing the work directly? So that was a whole set of questions. Who pays? But the other possibility was that the husband would pay. The husband pays the wife. That raises a whole other set of questions. The husband becomes her employer. What are her rights? So the debate was very, very rich and very productive. But eventually that idea changed. The idea of wages for housework is not really made by feminists so much anymore. Because we move to thinking, what does it do when you do wages for housework? You are concretizing the sexual division of labor. You are assuming that women have to do this work and we'll pay them for it. So now you're even freed of any responsibility of thinking of it as work which other people have to do. So feminists actually would prefer to think of socialized reproductive work. In other words, employers should be compelled to have, for example, childcare facilities at every workplace, not just where they employ women, everywhere. Because if you're going to think of children as human resources, which unfortunately that's the language of governmentality, right? That people are human resources. So if you're going to take children as resources, then the state has a responsibility. So, and the employers have a responsibility. So let there be universal childcare. Let there be socialized ways of housework, community kitchens, right? Isn't that better than pushing the woman back into the private individual space of the family and letting her be paid a wage to keep doing the work that she's doing? So the feminist debate went into thinking about this in a different way, that we should really be thinking of breaking down this individualized, privatized sexual division of labor. And if we are thinking big, let's think along the lines of socialized reproductive services. I do want to take one small second. I intended to start with this. Since many of you are first semester students, you may wonder, I did realize that some of you are wondering, why are we holding these meetings in this weather, in this space, in this very shortcut kind of a way with this and that and the other. It's not shortcut, but you might wonder why we're doing it, although it's very beautiful, the weather is. So you should know, the first semester students should know that we are not permitted to hold such events in the closed seminar rooms that we have in JNU. There is nothing dangerous about this talk. There is not this talk or any talk. There is not. What is dangerous is a critical thinking mind. And universities are the targets. Every university is the target of attack because universities have been at the forefront of resistance for the last decade. So this is not an accident. We are not mad that we want to stand in this heat. And so I'm also very, very appreciative of the fact that whenever such talks are held, there are actually so many students. But this is the reason. I thought I should explain, because I realized that at least one or two people didn't understand why we are doing it like this. It's because there is no permission to hold any event anywhere in any of the facilities of JNU. All right. So coming back to the workplace. So we need to first of all problematize and rethink the idea of the term workplace, because that implies that the home is not a space of work. So we first of all open up that. I also want to point out that when you look at something like the work participation rate, when you look at work participation rate of the female workforce, if you look at ILO reports or any kind of report on work participation rates, you get kind of broadly around 30%, and then there's of 30% of the female population working. Now this is the whole point, and this is what feminist economists have also been arguing about. How is work being defined when you're doing a census where you ask people, have you worked in the last 3 months? That's the kind of question that is asked. So if women have been doing housework, they tend to say no. Even if they have been working on their small farms, if it's their own farm, they tend to say no, because they were working on their own farm. So there's a way in which feminist economists have fought to include housework and to include this kind of work in the definition. So you see the arrangements that we are making. I mean, I haven't made, but look at the arrangements that are made to ensure that such things happen. This is what keeps JNU alive, folks. Okay, it's what keeps universities alive. Okay, so the very definition of work has had to be challenged by feminist economists, because otherwise it looks like a very small percentage of women actually work. And if you look at the reasons that are given in such reports for why there are declining work rate participation, they tend to give reasons like access to education. So when women go to be educated and they have access to higher education, they are not working. So it's a very strange, so it sounds like a negative thing, declining participation of women in the workforce, but if it's because they're going for higher education, that's a good thing, right? So there's a strangeness to the way in which work is calculated, work is understood, especially in the context of women, because a large part of what every woman does, of course you know, it's not a choice for women between being a housewife and being a housewife and a CEO, right? The choice is not that. The choice is, between being a housewife and a CEO, the choice is between being a CEO and a housewife or only a housewife. Because that's part of your... Now, once as feminists, if we raise the question of work like this, we are opening up questions of caste, we're opening up questions of class privilege, because then what happens is women of caste and class privilege are able to see, but you see how automatically I said women are able to employ other women to do their work, but the work is not the woman's work. The work is the work of the family, but the employer is seen as the woman. So it's like the memsab and the maid. But actually, it's the patriarchal class caste structure and the women who have to do this work for a wage and then go back and do that work without a wage in their own homes, right? So we need to open up the question of work. The second the second interesting or important word in this title is stereotypes in the workplace. And one stereotype which people like us would tend to have is when you think of workplace, so now for the moment I'm keep using the term workplace, having put it under a question mark, I'm going to just use it because it's there in the title. But if you think of a workplace, you think of an office. You're not thinking of, you and me, people like us, are not thinking of workplace as construction sites, fields, domestic work. You're thinking of the woman with her bag who just goes to an office. So then how do you open up the question of stereotypes, right? What are the stereotypes about construction workers? What are the stereotypes about farm workers? What are the stereotypes about women who are domestic servants? Not really any. So when you say stereotypes, I think that perhaps we are thinking only of the urban middle class woman who goes to an office and the stereotypes about her, because nobody is producing any stereotypes about working class women who are working continuously. So we need to break this. So when we say stereotypes of so-called working women, because the assumption is that other women aren't working, but the stereotype includes things like selfish, callous, thinking only about herself, doesn't care about the household, etc. So there are those kinds of stereotypes. I won't spend much time opening that up because I just wanted to point out that such stereotypes are usually about urban middle class women who go to office, and there are assumptions of their sexual availability, etc. And the issue of sexual harassment at the workplace, which was brought into prominence by the Visakhapatnam judgment of the Supreme Court, it pointed out that so you know that it came up in the context of Bhavri. Bhavri Devi was raped because she tried to stop a child marriage in her village. We take her name. We normally don't take the names of rape survivors and rape victims, but Bhavri Devi is a proud symbol of feminist struggle against rape. So we take her name proudly. We take her name with honor. So if you look at those guidelines, those are about raising questions about different kinds of workplaces and how to combat sexual harassment there. And this may come up in the question, so I'm not sure, perhaps Arunima may address it, but there was a GS cash which came out of the Vishakha guidelines, and there's the ICC which came out of 2013 law, and there are many issues with the difference very briefly between the GS cash coming out of the Vishakha guidelines and the ICC. GS cash is different forms of GS cash in different universities. Is that GS cash type of things were actually produced ground up. There were elected members, there were nominated members, there was a whole kind of democratic discussion about what the form of the sexual harassment committee should be in each university. So the body here didn't look exactly like the body in DU, it didn't look exactly like the body in Mehu, it took different forms. ICC is established by the employer. The employer nominates all the members. There is normally no space for election, but the employer can decide whether to give you election or not. And the control of the ICC is entirely in the hands of the employer, which is obviously very, very problematic in the cases of sexual harassment that go to ICC. So there have been now 10 years of ICCs functioning in different spaces. There are reports, and it shows that justice is hardly ever delivered. The third point is about security, and it says negotiating security. So security is actually a term also that we might want to question. Do as feminists, so when I'm like opening up the title like this, I don't mean it's not a good title. I think it's an excellent title because it helps us to think about all these terms. So when you think about security, is the goal of feminist politics security for women? Or is the goal of feminist politics protecting the agency and autonomy of women? They're two different things. Because security can mean, the language of security implies certain Lakshman Rekhas, as it were, right? So the assumption is in the workplace you're not safe. But women are not safe in the house. Women are not safe in homes. There is rape and sexual abuse in homes. There is violence, which is non-sexual, in homes. There's marital rape. There is the insecurity of the economic dependence on the husband, because women are not trained to do anything but marriage. Middle-class women are not trained for anything but marriage, and the pressure to get married starts very, very early. So this idea of security is again something we might want to open up. I'm expecting there'll be questions, so we can carry on later, also after Arunima finishes. So marriage as an institution, whether it is offering security at all, the idea is it offers you security, but in fact, it doesn't offer security to women. It's a patriarchal institution. There are very clear hierarchies. There are very clear expectations of what you're supposed to do in that marriage. So security is lacking for women at home and in the workplace. So we should rather be fighting not to get security, but to respect and honor our choices, our autonomy, our agency. That should be the goal. And I want to conclude with this point so it kind of goes back to what we began with, that there's a normalization of rape culture in this country. And by rape culture, I mean everything that happens, from the smallest comments and slogans comments and taunts that are made at women, a non-consensual, any kind of non-consensual action on your fellow student or by a faculty on a student. And of course, there are actually an average of 90 rapes a day. 90 rapes a day were reported in India in 2022. And these rapes are in the home. They're often, 90 are reported, but if the rapes are in the home, they're unlikely to be reported. So these are just the rapes by strangers. Tourists are routinely raped. We want to call ourselves Vishwa Guru, but this is what happens to women tourists in this country, right? They face sexual violence, they face sexual harassment, they face rape. So there's a normalization of rape culture. There's a way in which rape and sexual violence is minimized. There's also a mystification of rape itself. So the overall physical violence and the other kinds of violence and intimidation that women face doesn't have the same weight as saying you've been raped or sexually assaulted. If a body is found here of a woman, God forbid, I don't believe in God, universe forbid, a body is found here of a woman anywhere in a public space, badly bruised and battered, the first question will be, was she raped? She may not have been raped, but the question will, because that then becomes the issue, in a way in which the general intimidation we all face and the general ways in which our choices are limited. I'm sure at least 25% of the women present here have fought with their parents to do an MA. At least 25. Have had to fight to say, I'm going to go do an MA and I'm going to go do it in JNU. Right? That's how much you've had to fight. So that's not violence, it's violence. If you have to fight so much for a simple thing, so there's a certain patriarchal violence. So I'm going to put rape culture at the extreme end of the spectrum, but there's a certain patriarchal violence which we need to be alert to and aware of. And when we come back to rape itself, so 90 cases a day have been reported. And I do want to just conclude about rape by saying that the assumption seems to be we need tougher laws. We need another law, apparently, in the RG Kar case, right? We need a special law to protect doctors. Now, I think there is a way in which, and I realized, I've been realizing for a while, but in this instance, I realized that there's a way in which patients' families attack doctors if the patients don't survive, and that's really problematic. So there might be something that needs to be done to protect doctors in that sense, but we don't need more and tougher laws. We don't need the death sentence, because in fact, it's tougher laws and death sentence and so on which makes convictions so low. It's a very low rate of convictions, partly because when the judge thinks, and this is a worldwide phenomenon, feminists have argued against tougher laws and tougher punishments, and especially against death sentence for rape or for anything. Most of us are opposed to the death sentence in principle, because we realize that the death sentence was introduced in 2013 and has stopped rapes, 90 rapes a day. In 2022. It does not, tough laws do not act as a deterrent. When you go to court, judges then feel, if I have to send this man to jail for life or to sentence him to death, I have to have incontrovertible proof. And you are never going to have incontrovertible proof of sexual violence. Nobody is going to keep 5 witnesses to what you do with the sexual violence. So that's one reason, but the other reason why conviction rate is low is because either deliberately or because of carelessness, the actual investigation of rape cases is very lackadaisical. Evidence is not collected properly, the investigation is not carried out with any sense of, it's very shoddy, the investigation is very shoddy, so there's a low rate of conviction, and what we need is not tougher laws, and this is what all feminists say, what we need is the certainty of punishment. If you do this, if you show that 5 people have actually got the punishment, even if the punishment is 2 years in jail, or suspension for a semester if it's a student, or it may be a very so-called mild punishment, but a certainty, but that depends on the act, the exact act of sexual violence. The point is that certainty of punishment is what deters rape. The prevailing impunity, especially over the last 10 years, the prevailing impunity of public violence, lynching, mob violence, and stripping of women, all this, the way in which it has exploded in the last 10 years, this is because of impunity, and impunity, that is the confidence that there will be no punishment. That is what we have to fight, not better laws. Not more laws or tougher laws or better laws, but within the existing laws, actual investigation and actual punishment. So I'll stop here.